It was May 5, 1995. The time was 7:20 a.m., Western Netherlands, Wageningen. As American soldiers drove through the streets, Staff Sergeant William Cooper of the 101st Airborne Division stood on the edge of the small Dutch hamlet and watched as the citizens came out of their homes. He had previously witnessed the liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, so he expected the usual celebrations, waving flags, cheers, and perhaps some wine and kisses from grateful residents. Instead, he was stunned by what he saw. The people did not cheer as they slowly approached the American convoy. They just shuffled along. Children who looked more like ghosts than people, adults helping each other, and elderly people moving as if they were very old. At the side of the road stood a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a dress that had been altered several times to fit her limp body. Her eyes were huge in their sunken sockets, her face was skeletal, and her legs resembled sticks and clogs, probably the only shoes she owned. The girl stepped forward hesitantly as Cooper's Jeep came to a stop, her face showing a mixture of glowing hope and the caution of someone who had learned not to expect mercy. She didn't grin or wave. She was too weak to do anything more active than stand there and shiver a little. Cooper took a D-ration chocolate bar out of his backpack. He bent down and held it out to the girl, who just stared at it. For a moment, he thought she didn't know what it was. Then she suddenly reached out her hand as if it were the most precious thing in the world, grabbed the chocolate and pressed it to her chest. Her sunken cheeks filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered in barely intelligible English. "I am grateful. Thank you. Thank you." Behind her, 20, 30, 40 more children appeared, all emaciated, all with the same mixture of astonishment and hope in their eyes that they directed at the Americans. Cooper watched the shocked faces of his men as they realized what had happened to an entire generation of children after months of famine. Silently, Cooper gave the order, "Distribute all rations. Everything we have." The result was pure anarchy. Every bit of food the American forces had with them was distributed. Children sobbed as they held crackers, chocolate, and canned meat in their hands. Dutch parents were so grateful that they fell to their knees, and seasoned war veterans realized that helping starving children meant more to them than winning a battle. For Dutch citizens in the west of the Netherlands who had lived through the hunger winter of 1944-1945, American independence meant more than just political freedom or military triumph. For young people who were starving, it meant food. Gone were the days of helplessly watching their own children waste away. It was the moment when hope mysteriously returned after slowly dying during months of systematic famine, the deliberate deprivation. The hunger winter that ravaged the Western Netherlands from September 1944 to May 1945 was neither a natural disaster nor an unpleasant consequence of the war. It was a deliberate German strategy aimed at increasing suffering in the final months of the occupation and punishing the Dutch population for their support of the Allies. The systematic cruelty was documented in numbers. Approximately 4.5 million Dutch citizens in the Western Netherlands were affected. Between 18,000 and 22,000 deaths were directly related to malnutrition. It is believed that between 2,500 and 3,000 children lost their lives. Around 200,000 children showed signs of severe malnutrition at the time of independence. Daily calorie consumption in February 1945 was between 400 and 800 calories per person. At the beginning of 1945, food supplies came to a complete standstill for many weeks. In January 1945, there was hardly any fuel left for heating. After the unsuccessful Operation Market Garden, the Dutch government in exile called for a railway strike in September 1944 to support Allied operations, triggering the onset of the crisis. In retaliation, German officials imposed a food embargo on the Western Netherlands, cutting off supplies to the most densely populated area. The timing was disastrous. The embargo began at the start of winter, when normally harvested food keeps people warm during the cold season. With German forces obstructing road traffic and crippling the railway system, the Western Netherlands turned into a food desert where supplies could not be replenished and were depleted within weeks. The suffering of the Dutch civilian population was regularly ignored by the German occupation authorities. Requests for food aid were either rejected or ignored. International humanitarian organizations were not allowed to receive appeals for help. German military communiques explicitly stated this deliberate policy. The Netherlands' support for Allied operations would be punished with deprivation in order to teach them a lesson about the price of resistance, the descent into hunger. In diaries, letters, and eyewitness accounts that survived the conflict, Dutch citizens recorded the predictable patterns of the spread of hunger. With each threshold of despair crossed, the decline, from self-sufficiency to crisis to catastrophe, occurred gradually at first, then abruptly. In September and October 1944, rationing became stricter, but was still just enough. Despite the shortages, families largely maintained their normal daily routines, eating their supplies and hoping that the restrictions would soon be lifted. Between November and December 1944, supplies fell below the minimum subsistence level. Families consumed everything. Furniture was burned for fuel. Everything edible was removed from the gardens. Animals were slaughtered for their meat. First documented deaths from starvation, mainly among the elderly and sick. January to March 1995. Complete disaster. For weeks, the distribution of rations was irregular and was eventually stopped altogether. Tulip bulbs, which were poisonous but low in calories, were cooked by families. Sugar beets, originally used as animal feed, became a valuable commodity. The number of deaths rose sharply. April 19, 1995, the height of misery. The mortality rate peaked as spring approached, and no food supplies had survived the winter. Unable to provide even the most basic nutrition for their children, parents had to watch their children grow weaker and weaker. Mass graves were dug for the victims of the famine. Entire towns were on the verge of collapse. There are numerous reports of the psychological impact of witnessing young people starving. Parents reported how terrible it was to have nothing to feed their children, to see them grow weaker by the day, and to have to make difficult decisions about how to divide the meager food among several children. Knowing that your own children were dying and that there was nothing you could do to save them was deeply depressing. In March 1945, Anna Vandenberg, a mother of 3 from Amsterdam, wrote in her diary, "Today, my youngest asked for bread. I didn't have any. Because she is too weak to cry for long, she has stopped sobbing. She weighs about 30 pounds and is 7 years old. I watch helplessly as she dies. She will not survive unless the Americans come soon. They will not all come. I ask God for food, but it feels as if he is as far away as the Americans." The suffering of children. Children were hardest hit by the hunger winter because their developing bodies needed nutrition that was simply not available. Despite the impossibly difficult circumstances, Dutch doctors kept medical records and documented the physiological effects of acute malnutrition in children. The symptoms progressed predictably, beginning with weight loss, followed by muscle wasting, protein-deficient edema, organ system failure, and ultimately death. To maintain vital bodily functions, the children utilized their own tissue. The collapse of their immune systems made them susceptible to diseases that would normally have been harmless. Theoretically, open schools became scenes of horror. Teachers reported seeing children faint from hunger during class. Some children were too weak to walk to school. Since saving energy took priority over learning, some fell asleep at their desks. Students who appeared to be closest to death received small portions from the few teachers who still had food. In March 1945, I saw children in a condition I had previously only read about in medical textbooks on famine, kwashiorkor and marasmus, severe vitamin deficiencies that led to blindness and bone deformities, wrote Dr. Henrik Mulder, a pediatrician in Rotterdam who treated starving children during the crisis. 10-year-olds who weighed as much as healthy 5-year-olds. Some were too far gone to be saved by food. Months of malnutrition had destroyed their organs too much. All I could do was comfort them as they died. The psychological effects on the children were just as terrible. Their consciousness was dominated by chronic hunger. They lost their ability to play or participate in typical childhood activities and became lethargic and withdrawn. Some developed an obsession with food and talked incessantly about meals they had enjoyed before the embargo. Others stopped talking about food because it was too painful to talk about what they couldn't have. The dilemma of the Allies. The liberation of the Western Netherlands was delayed by strategic concerns of the Allied forces advancing through Europe in the early months of 1945. The area was not a direct route to Germany. There was no serious military threat from German soldiers. The war could be prolonged if resources were diverted to liberate the Western Netherlands, which would hinder the advance into Germany. However, the humanitarian situation behind German lines was known to Allied leaders. Information from refugees, messages from the Dutch resistance, and intelligence reports described the famine in detail. The choice between providing resources for humanitarian aid during the war and pursuing a quick military victory while the Dutch population starved became extremely troubling. The initial decision was to prioritize the military advance. After the collapse of Germany, the liberation of the Western Netherlands was to be one of the last operations. In the meantime, the Allies, the U.S. Army Air Forces with Operation Chow Hound, and the Royal Air Force with Operation Manna attempted to provide some relief by dropping food into starving areas. After talks with German commanders, who agreed not to fire on Allied aircraft carrying out humanitarian missions, the drops began in late April 1945. By dropping supplies over predetermined zones where starving residents could collect them, American and British bombers that had previously brought death to German cities now brought food to the Dutch people. Despite the urgently needed aid, the airdrops could not end the crisis. Only a small fraction of the affected people received supplies. Distribution was disorganized, and children in particular, who were already starving, needed continuous urgent food that sporadic airdrops could not provide. Systematic food aid and complete emancipation were still necessary. Local liberation. When the Western Netherlands was liberated by Allied ground forces in early May 1945, coinciding with the German surrender, they encountered a humanitarian situation that went beyond what intelligence reports had adequately described. Deaths and malnutrition were recorded in the data. The shocking truth that entire villages were on the verge of collapse was not adequately conveyed by them. As American and Canadian soldiers advanced into the Western Netherlands, they encountered people who both needed freedom and were too weak to properly enjoy it. People who had been malnourished for months reacted more cautiously, but all the more emotionally, replacing the usual scenes of joyful liberation, dancing in the streets, cheering crowds, bouquets of flowers thrown at the soldiers. "We had expected celebrations," said Captain Thomas Morrison, whose company was one of the first American units to arrive in Wageningen. What we experienced was much more moving and poignant. People left their homes cautiously and slowly, as if they were unsure whether they had the strength to celebrate. Many of them began to cry as soon as they realized we had food with us and were distributing it. Children stared at chocolate bars as if they had forgotten they existed. Women fell to their knees in gratitude, and grown men wept. It was the most emotional experience I had during the entire war. As quickly as possible, providing for the malnourished population became the top priority. Suddenly, combat troops who had previously focused on military targets were leading extensive humanitarian efforts. All food supplies were unpacked and distributed. Food was prepared regularly in field kitchens. The most malnourished patients were referred by medical personnel for immediate medical care. The American response. For the American soldiers who participated in the food distribution efforts in the Netherlands, this task was one of the most fulfilling aspects of their military careers. They had fought across Europe, won conflicts, and defeated German troops. Yet they felt that feeding starving Dutch children was more important than winning a battle. The soldiers' response went beyond simply fulfilling their duties and following orders. They shared their own rations, distributed personal supplies, played with Dutch children, and helped families when they were off duty. Their humanitarian efforts became a personal commitment to helping the people they had grown fond of. "We are feeding Dutch families who have not had proper food for months," Private First Class Eugene Henderson wrote in a letter to his family in Massachusetts in May 1945. "When you give chocolate to the children, they cry, not because they are depressed, but because they are so grateful that they cannot control their emotions. A little girl gave me a flower she had picked yesterday. She wanted to give it to me because I had given her food, and that was all she could offer me. I cried. I'm not ashamed to say that. We fought this war for this reason, so that children like her could enjoy flowers instead of suffering from hunger." American soldiers and Dutch civilians immediately developed a deep bond because of their shared culture. The Netherlands was a country in Western Europe whose inhabitants spoke some English, had democratic traditions, and had cultural ties to America. Compared to some other liberated areas, the relationship was easier and more organic. To share what little they had regained, Dutch families took American soldiers into their homes. In return, the Americans offered friendship, food, and resources. American soldiers were accompanied by children who practiced their English, asked about America, and showed them the rebuilt communities. These bonds gave rise to genuine intercultural friendships that extended beyond the military occupation. The children's recovery. It took months of careful nutrition and medical care for the Dutch children who were suffering from severe malnutrition to recover physically. Once food was available again, bodies that had been starved for a long time could not simply return to their normal functions. Medical problems caused by prolonged deprivation often hampered the careful, controlled rehabilitation process. Specialized clinics for treating malnutrition in children were set up by American and Allied medical personnel. The facilities included monitoring problems, administering vitamin supplements, treating illnesses that had developed during the famine, and supervised nutrition. The comprehensive care was a major investment of medical resources for the general public. Psychological rehabilitation was equally important and complex. Children needed more than just food after suffering chronic hunger for months or years, witnessing starvation deaths, and experiencing the fear of not knowing whether they would survive. They needed time to recover from the trauma, as well as security and stability. To help Dutch children return to normal childhood experiences, the Allies set up schools, entertainment programs, and other activities. American soldiers organized sports and parties, taught Dutch children American songs, and played baseball with them. Through typical childhood experiences, the activities provided psychological therapy in addition to entertainment. The final reality. Neither military strategy nor political emancipation were ever at the center of the story of Dutch civilians who cried when American soldiers rescued their children. It was about feeding starving children, the most basic human duty, and about what happens when wealthy countries decide to use their resources for humanitarian, rather than purely military purposes. The American soldiers were neither fulfilling their duties nor following orders when they opened their supplies and fed starving Dutch children. Most of them violated regulations on the storage of military supplies. By deciding that feeding dying children was more important than storing supplies for combat units, they made moral choices that placed human suffering above logistical efficiency. The Dutch citizens who wept when the Americans brought food were not celebrating a military triumph or political freedom. They felt the enormous relief of parents who had watched their children starve and now miraculously had food for them. Essentially, those tears were about life and death, about children who would survive instead of dying because they were cared for by wealthy strangers. Victory meant more than just conquering armies, as the liberation of the Netherlands showed. It could save young people from starvation. It could mean that democracies respect human life so much that they spend enormous sums on relief efforts. Because one nation remembered that another had saved its children from death. This could lead to bonds being formed between nations that lasted for generations. This experience completely changed Dutch children's perception of America as they survived the hunger winter, thanks to food provided by American soldiers. As they grew older, they learned that Americans had saved their lives, that democratic governments could be both militarily strong and incredibly benevolent, and that adversaries could become liberators who cared about the lives of their children. Moreover, this experience gave the American soldiers who participated in the food distribution efforts a sense of purpose that went beyond military service. More importantly, they had spared the lives of children, even though they had contributed to victory in a war. They had participated in something that showed how compassionate people can be, despite the horrors of total war. The emaciated children in wooden shoes who cried because strangers showed them kindness, who saw hope again after months of grief, who stared at chocolate bars as if they were miracles. They were alive. They were healthy, like children. They brought wealth and serenity to their own children. They became living proof that compassion can overcome systemic cruelty, that society can choose to feed the hungry rather than ignore their suffering, and that even in the darkest hours of war, a single kind gesture, a bar of chocolate or a can of rations can make a difference.